You know, the moment conflict hits, the tragedy is right there. It's instant. It's visible. You see the destroyed buildings, the people forced to flee. But just beneath that immediate awful destruction, there's this other huge loss happening. The kind of instant erasure of culture, memory, identity. It's not just about losing the stones and the glass, you know? It's losing the living memory they hold. And the big question really for anyone thinking about the future is, how do you actually recover that systematically, even while the threat might still be there? How do you make sure that you don't just swap structural destruction for cultural amnesia? Welcome to Reform Thinking, the deep dive where we look at these big systems, the ones designed to work when everything else is breaking down. Today, we've got this incredibly detailed framework for cultural heritage recovery. It treats it less like, you know, an emergency cleanup job and more like managing essential social infrastructure. It's like an operating manual, really pragmatic when it needs to be for safety, but absolutely principled where integrity matters.
And that systematic approach, that's really what stands out in the material we're looking at. Our mission today really is to unpack this structured, multi-layered framework. It's designed not just to, fix old things, but to safeguard, restore, and crucially reactivate a whole cultural ecosystem. We're looking at this cultural landscape, everything from a huge national archive down to, say, local festival traditions as living social infrastructure. So we're focusing on the rules, the absolute non-negotiables, the data protocols that make sure this recovery is driven by evidence and really focused on the community.
And what jumps out right away is the core idea driving it all. Rebuilding culture isn't secondary. It's absolutely central to national recovery. It's not something you bolt on after you've got the roads fixed and the power back on. It's seen as a primary system. Why? Well, because culture is what carries memory, meaning our moral imagination. If you lose that, you lose the very glue that holds civil society together while it tries to rebuild.
Right. And that big systematic purpose gets channeled into this defined threefold aim. It's like the compass for the whole program. Make sure every dollar, every action points towards the same goal. First, the aim is to protect the people and the assets that are still there. That means quick risk reduction, getting security measures up fast. Second, the aim is to restore places and collections with integrity. That means the work has to be guided by authenticity, reversibility, proper public consultation. And third, the program has to renew the practices, the skills, the institutions that, knit communities together. It sees culture as a system that produces things like skilled jobs and resilient cities.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then. Starting right at the beginning, that immediate response phase, always the most chaotic, isn't it? And the most critical for preventing long-term damage. Phase 0, they call it.
Phase 0, yeah, it's called secure and stabilize. And it's defined by a really aggressive timeline, month 0 through month 6. But importantly, it doesn't just start neatly after 6 months, it starts the second axis as possible, and it keeps running in rolling waves as long as threats persist. So if there's another strike or maybe a big seasonal threat like a hurricane, the process just kicks back in. The immediate goal is simple on paper, but tough in reality. Prevent any more loss of life and heritage. That initial discipline, it sets the tone for everything else.
And this phase seems to stand on 3 really clinical action pillars. Let's start with the one you just cannot compromise on. Life safety and stabilization. The absolute first action before anyone even touches a single object or stone is securing human life. Makes sense. This means immediate coordination with specialist teams, specifically deminers, right, to clear unexploded ordnance, UXO.
Exactly. UXO clearance is paramount.
And structural engineers, too, to assess the immediate risk of collapse.
Yes, and the rule is absolutely non-negotiable. Nobody goes in until there are clearance certificates and engineer sign-offs, period.
No artifact, no archive is worth a life.
Absolutely not. Once it's cleared, then stabilization begins. And it follows this logic they call least invasive first.
Least invasive first. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It's critical. It means the teams focus on temporary fixes, not rushing into reconstruction. Think about immediate temporary bracing, putting up wooden shores to hold up a cracking wall or a collapsing arch, or quick water diversion using temporary channels, maybe sandbags, drains. And probably the most critical option, the one that often decides the fate of an interior space, is rapidly tarping roofs and openings, especially if there's a storm coming within, say, 48 hours.
Ah, okay. So those small choices in the first few days, like just getting the tarp over a hole in the roof, can actually save entire collections, frescoes, whatever's inside, from water or frost damage later on.
Precisely. It's that immediate preventative thinking.
And what about once they get inside? Especially if you've got collections, documents, textiles, art that have been hit by water or smoke?
Right, for interiors and collections, the program uses this core mantra: lift, dry, and cool. Sounds simple. But the mechanics behind it are based on real conservation science. Lift. That means getting textiles, photos, paintings, anything vulnerable up off wet floors immediately. Stops the water wicking up, prevents total saturation.
Yeah.
This involves setting up minimal but measured climate control, using portable dehumidifiers, data loggers to track humidity. The goal is controlled air exchange, not blasting things with heat, which can shatter fragile materials.
Yeah.
Cool. Now, this is the one that sounds a bit strange at first. For wet documents, books, archives, the main instruction is actually to freeze them, using refrigerated containers or even blast freezers if they're available.
Wait, freeze them? Why freezing? Wouldn't that cause more damage, like ice crystals?
It does sound counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it's absolutely essential triage, especially in damp or humid conditions. The water damage itself, while bad, might be survivable for the paper. But the biological decay, that's the killer. Within, say, 48 to 72 hours of getting wet, mold and mildew just explode. They cause irreversible damage to the paper fibers, the glues and bindings, and crucially, the ink it starts to bleed and run.
Ah, I see.
Freezing instantly stops all that biological and chemical degradation. It just hits pause. It buys the recovery team crucial time. It allows the collection to be moved later to specialized facilities for controlled drying, often using freeze drying or vacuum methods that pull the moisture out slowly without physical damage. So that decision, freeze it now, can literally save thousands of years of documented history from being just wiped out by mold.
Okay, that shifts the focus. It's not about an immediate fix, but controlled preservation for later.
Got it.
The second pillar is just as practical: triage and anti-looting measures.
Yes. As soon as custodians can safely get in, they activate a triage system. This creates an operational picture, helps decide where the limited resources go first. Buildings, collections, they get classified using simple color codes. Red means critical, unstable, immediate danger of collapse or total loss. Amber means damaged but accessible, needs medium-term stabilization. And green means stable, maybe just minor issues.
And that classification then dictates resource allocation, like deciding which building gets the only structural engineer available that day.
Exactly. If you've got 10 damaged buildings but only enough temporary bracing for one, the triage tells you which red site needs it most urgently. And running alongside that is anti-looting deterrence. This is a mix of, tech solutions and community involvement. Physical security might mean temporary fencing, boarding up doors and windows, maybe some discreet low-power night lighting.
But you mentioned community solutions.
Yeah, and often that's the most crucial bit. They activate community guardianship teams. These are often retired locals, maybe former employees who know the site well. They walk regular circuits, they take photos if anything looks disturbed, they report suspicious activity. That local ownership, that pair of eyes on the ground, is frequently the best deterrent against opportunistic theft.
Speaking of theft and accountability, you mentioned a mandatory chain of custody protocol. How detailed does that have to be, especially when teams are working under pressure in an emergency?
It has to be rigorous, even under pressure. The chain of custody protocol is the vital link between security now and accountability later. The rule is every single object, even a fragment or a document that gets moved from its original spot, must get a temporary ID number, a photograph, and a traceable chain of custody tag.
Okay.
And this isn't just bureaucracy. It's a forensic and legal necessity. The record has to show who moved it, the exact date and time, precisely where it was found, using GPS coordinates if possible, or at least specific room numbering and exactly where it was moved to.
Why is that level of detail so critical?
It prevents loss in the chaos. It reduces arguments later about theft. You have proof the item was there after the damage occurred. And it stops terrible errors, like mixing up fragments from two different archaeological sites, which you just can't undo later. Plus, that documented chain provides the legal backbone if items inevitably show up on the illicit antiquities market years later. It gives prosecutors the evidence they need about origin and seizure history.
That disciplined documentation leads straight into the third pillar, doesn't it? The one that lays the groundwork for everything that follows rigorous documentation under that mandatory instruction. Scan before scaffold. That phrase, scan before scaffold, it's so vivid, so clear. It means documentation happens before any scaffolding goes up, before anything gets shored up, braced, or removed. Why the absolute insistence on that order? What information gets lost if they wait?
Because any physical intervention, even if it's totally necessary for safety, immediately erases critical forensic evidence and geometric information. It just wipes it away. If you put a wooden shore under a collapsing wall, you've changed how the forces are distributed. You've altered the exact geometry of the collapse that resulted from, say, a blast. If you start clearing debris, You lose the spatial relationship between fragments, how they fell, where they landed relative to each other. The ability to forensically analyze what happened and plan an authentic repair later is massively compromised.
Okay, so the act of saving it can actually destroy the evidence needed to save it properly.
In a way, yes. So teams have to take rapid documentation passes immediately, as soon as it's safe. These passes can vary depending on what tech is available. It might be simple orthogonal photos, so straight-on shots, and short 360-degree videos for quick context. But the real goal is metric data capture. That means photogrammetry passes, which capture texture and color really accurately, or handheld LiDAR sweeps, which capture precise 3D
A
geometry.
lighter, like the scanners.
Exactly. The key is that this documentation captures the geometry and the condition in situ, exactly as it is, before any physical intervention changes that picture. This captured data, the site dossier with maps, hazard notes, images, maybe even forensic blast patterns, is absolutely vital for every single decision made later on. And it feeds directly into that national data core, the single source of truth.
So scanning before scaffolding isn't just a suggestion, it's a core operational command.
It is. This commitment to capturing the site's condition before messing with it ensures that decisions about rebuilding, sometimes years down the line, are based purely on evidence on what actually happened, not on someone's hazy memory, guesswork, or wishful thinking. And that rigorous documentation requirement from Phase 0, that scan before scaffold rule, that's the fuel. It feeds the central engine of information management for the whole recovery effort, the single source of truth, or SSOT.
The SOT. You described it as the data core, the sort of countrywide memory machine. But what does a national interoperable system like that actually do on the ground, given the chaos? Why make the effort to centralize all this scattered data into one place?
Well, the need for a single unified system comes down to discipline and accountability. Those are things that can easily get lost in a massive multi-year recovery effort with lots of different players.
Yeah.
The SOT serves several really critical functions. First, guidance. It ensures that every single decision, from the tiniest emergency fix like where exactly to patch a roof temporarily, right up to the big strategic actions like how to sequence a multi-million-dollar, multi-year restoration project, rests firmly on verifiable evidence that was captured in the field.
So it stops decisions being made based on, I don't know, gut feeling or political pressure.
Precisely. It forces decisions back to the data. Second, transparency. The SSOT is the mandatory platform for publishing all project scores, we'll get to scoring later, and the links to the evidence behind those scores. Any citizen, any local custodian who cares for the site, any international donor footing the bill must be able to go in and audit the decision-making process. They can see the digital dossier, the photos, the reports that led to a project getting funded or prioritized.
So it builds trust by making the process visible.
Exactly. Public visibility turns that potential opacity, that suspicion about where the money's going, into trust. And that's absolutely vital when you're managing international funds and community expectations over potentially a decade or more. Third, operational architecture. The SSOT isn't just a database, it's a GIS native database.
GIS meaning Geographic Information System. Spatially aware.
Yes, spatially aware. It layers information geographically. So you have your heritage assets, churches, archives, monuments, archaeological sites layered visually on a map with known hazards that can be verified, UXO locations, floodplains, areas prone to landslides, ground instability, or the scientifically mapped impact zones from specific blasts.
Okay.
And then you layer on crucial urban infrastructure data. Where are the utilities, the emergency shelters? What are the planning zones? It creates a comprehensive operational picture.
That GIS integration sounds incredibly useful for managing risk in real time. Can you give an example of how that operational architecture might actually help save a specific building or collection?
Sure. Because the system is GIS native, it can do things automatically. Say a new blast site is verified and mapped. The SOT can instantly calculate the likely impact radius based on ordnance type and distance. Then it automatically flags all registered heritage assets sitting within that high-impact zone. This generates immediate actionable intelligence for the teams on the ground.
So it tells them where to look first.
Exactly. It allows managers to create dashboards, for example, a stabilization dashboard that tracks, say, all red classified buildings with documented roof damage before a major rainstorm or a predicted freeze is about to hit. Without the SST correlating weather forecasts, hazard data, and the real-time status of assets, those vulnerable sites would rely on slow, manual checks. You'd inevitably miss some, leading to avoidable secondary losses from water getting in, mold growth, freeze-thaw cycles destroying masonry.
Right, so it connects the dots much faster.
Much faster. And because this beta core is so unbelievably critical, I mean, it holds the evidence for potential war crimes trials. It's the foundation for all future restoration work. It's the public record of what happened. The framework mandates extremely robust data security. They use what's called the 3-2-1 backup rule.
The 3-2-1 rule. That level of mandatory backup suggests they treat data loss just as seriously as losing an actual building. Walk us through the nuts and bolts of that rule. How does it protect against things like hardware failure or cyber attacks or even just the instability of the region?
The 3-2-1 rule is designed for resilience against pretty much every likely way data can be lost, from simple hard drive failure or accidental deletion, right up to a coordinated cyber attack or a major power grid failure in the main city. It mandates 3 specific criteria for all the critical heritage data held within the SSOT. 1. 3 copies of the data. That means you have your primary working copy, the one being actively used, plus 2 completely separate backup copies. This protects against immediate file corruption or just simple human error during data handling.
Okay, 3 copies.
2. 2 different types of media. This tackles the risk of one particular storage technology failing or becoming obsolete. For example, the main working copy might be on fast solid-state drives, SSDs, for quick access. But the backups might be stored on, say, older but reliable magnetic tape, or maybe immutable cloud storage that can't be easily changed or deleted. So if there's a sudden flaw discovered in all SSDs or a specific virus targets them, the magnetic tape backup offers a completely different, unaffected way to recover the data.
Right, don't put all your eggs in one technological basket.
Exactly. And 3, 1 copy must be kept off-site. This is the crucial safeguard against localized disaster or geopolitical instability. If the main server farm or data center gets physically compromised by a fire, a flood, a direct hit, or even just a prolonged regional power outage, a complete, encrypted, and reasonably recent copy of the entire SSOT must physically reside in a secure, verifiable location somewhere else. Sometimes this might even be in a partner nation, completely outside the conflict zone.
Wow, so that level of enforced redundancy means the evidence base, the national memory, should survive pretty much anything thrown at it.
That's the goal. Maximum resilience for irreplaceable data.
Okay, so the SSOT is the brain, holding all the evidence, protected by the 3-2-1 rule. Now let's look at the actual work, the body, and the ethical and legal principles that have to guide every single action on the ground. Hashtag 3. Core principles and mandatory gating checks. So before any big money gets spent, before any major construction starts, the actual work has to stick to a set of really strict ethical and technical principles. These are the non-negotiables, right? The rules that ensure the work has integrity. Let's look at some of the most important ones, starting with authenticity and integrity.
Authenticity is really the cornerstone of responsible cultural recovery. This principle demands minimum intervention. That means you only do what is absolutely necessary to make the asset safe and stable. You don't over-restore. And crucially, any new work you do put in must be designed from the start to be reversible. The idea is that future generations, maybe with better technology or a different understanding, should be able to undo our work if they need to without damaging the original fabric.
So it imposes a kind of humility on the restorers.
Absolutely. A recognition that we don't have all the answers forever. And critically, tied to authenticity is legibility. New work must be legible. This is what stops restoration sliding into basically forgery. Legibility means the new material, the repair, must be distinguishable from the original, if you look closely. Shouldn't scream, "I'm new," from across the street, but it shouldn't pretend to be ancient either. It avoids both neglect and that kind of overly sentimental, fake-looking pastiche.
That sounds like an incredibly fine line to walk. How do you actually do that in practice? How does a restorer make new work legible but quiet without just sticking in, I don't know, a modern steel beam that clashes completely with an old stone wall?
It really comes down to material science and careful design detailing. For example, if you're restoring a section of historic brickwork, the new mortar you use would be chemically compatible. Maybe an identical traditional lime mortar mix, but perhaps it contains a tiny amount of a specific different colored sand aggregate or a subtle pigment. So up close, an expert or even a careful observer can see the difference between the original mortar joints and the new ones.
Ah, okay.
Or, if you're reconstructing a piece of carved stone, the new block might be sourced from the exact same quarry, but maybe it's cut with a very slightly different tool mark pattern, or finished with the discrete shadow line incised at the edge, or even a tiny hidden date marker carved somewhere inconspicuous. The point is, the truth of the intervention is visible on close inspection, but the overall visual harmony and character of the structure are maintained. You avoid using anachronistic modern materials that shout, but you also strictly avoid trying to perfectly replicate age, damage, or patina, because that would be a lie.
All right. Honesty in materials, that makes sense. The other core principle you mentioned was risk reduction, often talked about as build back better.
That's right. Risk reduction means that when you intervene, you have to integrate improved fire protection and better climate resilience right into the design from the very beginning. They're not optional extras you add on if there's budget left over. Think about it. If a historic building survives shelling, only to be destroyed 5 years later by preventable electrical fire, or riddled with mold because of changing rainfall patterns and poor drainage, then the recovery has ultimately failed.
So it's about future-proofing the asset as you repair it.
Exactly. This often means things like subtly integrating reversible secondary glazing behind historic window frames to improve energy efficiency and reduce condensation risk, or improving rainwater drainage capacity off roofs and away from foundations, or installing state-of-the-art non-invasive fire suppression systems like misting systems that won't damage the historic fabric. The principle is, when you have the chance to rebuild or repair, you must use that opportunity to improve the asset's fundamental ability to survive the next 100 years of environmental threats, climate change, and potential human impacts.
Got it. What are some of the other key principles?
Well, there's universal design. Access for everyone, including the elderly, children, people with disabilities, has to be a baseline requirement, not an afterthought. Integrated thoughtfully into ramp designs, pathway materials, signage. Then there's transparency and participation. This mandates that the local communities, the actual users and custodians of these places, must have a real documented voice in the decisions that affect their heritage. And finally, subsidiarity. This is about pushing decision-making down to the lowest practical level as close as possible to the local custodians who know the place best, while still maintaining national standards for quality, evidence, and ethics.
Okay, so those principles provide the overall philosophy, the ethical compass. But before any actual design work starts or concrete gets poured, there are these mandatory pass-fail checks that every single project has to clear. The mandatory gating checks. If any one of these gates is red, the project stops, full stop, regardless of how important it seems or who's pushing for it.
Precisely. These 3 gates are the practical mechanism that enforces discipline across the whole system. They stop resources being wasted on projects that aren't ready, aren't safe, or aren't viable. The first gate is security. Seems obvious, but it has strict metrics behind it. Is access to the site safe and consistently secure? Has the unexploded ordnance, the UXO clearance, been fully completed and officially certified? And based on the current conflict analysis, are further strikes reasonably mitigated? Is it just too dangerous right now? If that security check comes back red, no personnel are put at risk. End of story. The project simply pauses, waits in the system, until the operational picture on the ground changes and it becomes safe to proceed.
Okay, safety first, literally. Then comes the evidence gate. This is where the SSOT, the single source of truth, really comes into play, isn't it?
Absolutely. The evidence gate asks a simple question. Is there a minimum acceptable dossier of information available right now to actually justify and properly inform the proposed intervention? This dossier must include certain things: a measured survey, accurate drawings or scans, a certified condition report detailing the damage, photos, and ideally 3D capture proving they followed the scan before scaffold rule,
Yeah.
any relevant archival references like old plans or photos, and notes from consultations with stakeholders like the local community or religious leaders.
And if that evidence isn't there, if the dossier is incomplete.
If that gate is red, the instruction isn't to push ahead anyway. It's to shift priorities back to stabilization and more documentation. Go back, gather the missing evidence. No project is allowed to move forward based on guesswork, incomplete information, or just hazy memories of what used to be there. The evidence has to be solid.
Right, evidence-led. The third gate is feasibility. This sounds like where the rubber meets the road in terms of resources.
It is. This is perhaps the most strategically important gate because it connects the individual project to the bigger picture of national resources. The questions here are the necessary skills actually available right now? Do we have the craftspeople? Are the specific traditional materials needed, like the right kind of stone or properly seasoned timber or specific lime, actually obtainable? Is there a realistic budget envelope identified? Are the logistics of getting materials and people to the site actually workable? And crucially, the killer question: Can this specific project be done now without negatively impacting other possibly higher priority sites elsewhere by sucking up the limited national supply of master craftspeople, conservators, or unique materials?
So that feasibility gate acts as a check on the whole national capacity.
Hmm.
So if, say, there are only 5 certified traditional lime plasters in the entire country who can do a specific type of intricate work, the SSOT has to track where they're allocated. And a new project, even if it passes security and evidence, might get paused at feasibility simply because those essential skilled hands aren't available yet. They're tied up on another priority job.
That is precisely the strategic function of the feasibility gate. It prevents a chaotic first-come, first-served system, which would inevitably lead to either low-quality work done by unqualified people, or worse, it would starve the most culturally significant and complex projects of the absolutely essential specialists they require to be done properly. If the master carpenter needed for Project B is still working on Project A for the next 6 months, then Project B's feasibility gate stays red until that critical resource is scheduled to be freed up. It forces realistic, responsible sequencing based on actual capacity.
So if any of those 3 gates, security, evidence, or feasibility, shows red, the system enforces discipline. The project stops, maybe the scope gets adjusted, or it just waits. Resources aren't thrown haphazardly at things that aren't ready.
That's the idea. Discipline through process.
Okay, this is where, for me, the architectural and ethical thinking gets really, really interesting. Once a project does clear those first 3 gates, it's safe, the evidence is there, it's feasible. The path forward isn't just, okay, rebuild it. It gets channeled into one of 4 very specific predefined options. They call them honest endpoints. This structured decision tree seems designed specifically to prevent bad choices being made in the heat of the moment, or driven purely by emotion or wanting things back the way they were.
That's exactly right. These 4 endpoints function as a mandatory options analysis. Before you design anything, you have to determine which of these 4 fundamental types of intervention is appropriate, based on the evidence. This structured approach stops decision makers just defaulting to reconstruction simply because it feels good or looks good politically. Instead, it forces everyone to honestly confront the reality of the evidence base, the state of the surviving fabric, and the resources actually available.
Okay, let's walk through them. The first one, endpoint 1, is conserve repair. This sounds like the preferred path, the most common one.
It is generally the preferred endpoint when possible. This option is chosen when a significant amount of the authentic, original material, the historic fabric, survives, and it can be successfully stabilized, repaired, and made safe and usable again. The design guidance here reinforces those core principles we talked about. Prioritize minimum intervention, do only what's necessary, and ensure you use compatible materials repairing like for like. That often means using traditional materials again, like specific lime mortars that breathe correctly with old masonry, traditional plasters, or locally sourced timber repaired using traditional joinery techniques.
So it's about careful, respectful repair.
Yes. And the repair work also focuses on discreetly upgrading safety and performance where possible, without compromising the character. This might involve those reversible secondary glazing units we mentioned for better thermal performance, or integrating modern, non-damaging fire suppression systems. The guiding principle is always to preserve the final asset's authentic character, its patina, its proportions, its overall atmosphere. The repair must be legible up close, as we discussed, but the building's history shouldn't be visually overwhelmed by the new work. This is the endpoint that fundamentally preserves the most historical truth.
Okay, that makes sense. The second endpoint, anastylosis reconstruction, sounds like it carries much higher stakes and potentially significant ethical risks if it's done badly, right? How strictly is this one controlled?
Oh, it's the most restrictive endpoint by far, and it's undertaken rarely, precisely because that ethical bar is incredibly high. Get it wrong, and you're essentially faking history. Now, anastylosis, strictly defined, means carefully re-erecting a collapsed structure using its original fallen components. Think of numbering fallen column drums and putting them back together in the right order. Reconstruction is more about recreating a lost element, potentially from new materials, because the original is gone or too damaged.
And the rules for allowing this are tough.
Extremely tough. The preconditions are designed specifically to prevent the falsification of history or building based on myth. First, the lost element must be absolutely central to the identity and meaning of the place. Its absence has to compromise the entire cultural significance. It can't just be any lost bit. Second, and this is non-negotiable, the evidence base has to be rock solid. robust. This means you need comprehensive, certified, pre-war documentation, original blueprints, detailed architectural surveys, high-quality historical photographs. Or, alternatively, you need conclusive forensic evidence from the site itself, like detailed 3D scans taken immediately after damage that clearly show the original geometry before collapse.
And if that evidence is patchy or just based on memory?
If the evidence is incomplete or ambiguous or relies on hearsay, then this option, reconstruction, is completely off the table. You cannot rebuild based on speculation.
Okay, let's say the evidence is robust enough. They decide they can proceed with reconstruction. What design guidance is in place then to make sure they're being absolutely truthful about what's original and what's new?
The guidance mandates total honesty in the execution. The design must establish clear, visually discernible lines between the surviving original fabric and the new reconstructed fabric. There should be no attempt to blur that line or fool the viewer. Techniques must ensure no falsification of history occurs. For instance, if you're using new stone in a reconstructed wall section, it might be sourced from the identical quarry bed as the original, but perhaps the surface tooling is deliberately left slightly different. Or maybe the joints are pointed with that subtly distinct mortar mix we talked about. Or perhaps there's a discrete date inscription. The modern hand must be acknowledged.
So visible honesty.
Visible honesty. And crucially, for this path, an acidosis or reconstruction international peer review by conservation experts and broad documented community consultation are both absolutely mandatory. This underlines the fact that reconstruction isn't just a local building project. It's a serious act of historical interpretation performed under global scrutiny. It's meant to stop it becoming a purely political exercise or a sentimental fantasy.
That focus on verifiable evidence and peer review really builds in accountability for what could easily go wrong. Okay, option 3. Contemporary replacement. When is this chosen?
Contemporary replacement comes into play when the physical evidence of the destroyed structure is really just fragmentary, or maybe even non-existent. Or perhaps the building that was destroyed was already in very poor condition before the conflict, maybe structurally unsound or heavily altered. Or, importantly, it might be chosen when completely new functions are desperately needed by the community now, functions that the old building simply couldn't accommodate. This choice allows architects to design for the present and future while still acknowledging and respecting the past context.
So it's about building something new, but fitting it in respectfully.
Exactly. The design guidance here is very clear. The new architecture must be contextual. It has to respect the established historic urban grain of the area, things like the prevailing building heights, the rhythm of facades along the street, the dominant material palettes, the plot widths. But equally, the new building must be, frankly, of its time. It should be clearly identifiable as 21st century architecture. It must strictly avoid pastiche, that superficial copying of historical styles that ends up looking fake. And it must also avoid speculative oversizing building something much bigger than the context just because you can.
How do they enforce that? How do you stop someone putting up, say, a giant glass box right next to a row of historic 19th century buildings, even if they argue it's, frankly, of its time? How is that contextual respect enforced?
That's where a formal process called a Heritage Impact Assessment, or HIA, comes in. It's mandatory for every proposed contemporary replacement within a designated historic zone. The HIA is a specialized study. It analyzes the potential impact of the proposed new design on the character and significance of the historic setting. It looks specifically at things like view corridors. Will the new building block important views? Scale and massing, is it just too big or bulky compared to its neighbors? Material harmony, do the proposed materials clash jarringly?
So the HIA provides objective analysis.
Yes. For instance, if the HIA determines that a proposed 5-story contemporary building would completely break the consistent 3-story roofline of the adjacent historic streetscape and negatively impact its character, then the design must be revised. The HIA translates that principle of respecting historic rhythm into concrete, binding architectural parameters that the planners and designers have to adhere to.
Got it. It's a check and balance. And finally, the fourth endpoint, ruin as memorial. This sounds like potentially the most emotionally difficult choice, but maybe sometimes the most ethically necessary one.
It often is the most difficult conversation to have, yes. This option involves deliberately choosing not to rebuild the structure. Instead, the focus is on carefully stabilizing the surviving remnants, the ruins, and creating safe public access for interpretation and reflection. It's chosen in specific circumstances. Perhaps the loss itself, the event that caused the destruction, carries such profound meaning that the physical scar on the landscape should remain visible as a permanent testament. Think of sites associated with massacres or major historical traumas. Or it might be chosen when rebuilding would simply drain scarce resources away from other projects that have a higher public value or serve more urgent community needs. Or, critically, it's chosen when rebuilding would fundamentally falsify history because there's simply no reliable evidence of what was there before. Rebuilding in that case would be pure invention.
So if ruin as memorial is chosen, what does the actual work involve? It's not just leaving it to crumble further, presumably.
No, absolutely not neglect. The design guidance focuses on two things. Safe stabilization of the remnants, that means carefully shoring up unstable walls, capping exposed wall tops to prevent water getting in and causing frost damage, maybe consolidating fragile masonry. Just enough intervention to stop further natural decay and make the site safe for visitors. And second, creating sober and durable interpretation. This means installing carefully considered plaques, perhaps lists of names, dates, survivor testimonies, historical context, whatever is needed to truthfully explain the loss and the significance of the event that occurred there. It ensures the site becomes an active place of memory, a memorial to the event itself, preventing that crucial historical moment from being simply erased, paved over, or forgotten over time. Hashtag Tag 5, prioritization and long-term life cycle sustainability.
Okay, so every project that gets through the gates is now channeled into one of those four honest directions: conserve or repair, reconstruct, replace, or memorialize. But you're still going to have potentially hundreds of projects, all deemed worthy, all needing funds. How do they then decide which of those worthy projects gets the actual limited national funding first? You mentioned a scoring rubric earlier. This sounds like where it comes into play to ensure choices aren't just about what's cheapest or easiest to do quickly.
That's exactly its purpose. A standardized weighted scoring rubric is applied to every single capital proposal that has passed the initial gates. It generates a score, typically on a 0 to 100 scale.
Yeah.
And this score is what governs the final decisions on funding allocation and the sequencing of projects. The crucial design feature of this rubric, the thing that makes it align with the program's core values, is that non-economic factors, cultural and social value, are deliberately weighted very heavily in calculating that final score.
Right. Let's break down those criteria then. Which factors get the biggest weight? The ones that really show the focus is on culture and community, not just a simple cost-benefit analysis.
The highest weighting deliberately goes to cultural and social utility. Top of the list is significance to national and community identity. This carries the largest single weight, often around 20% of the total score. This criterion assesses the irreplaceable cultural value of the asset. Is it unique? Is it historically pivotal? Is it absolutely central to local religious practice or community identity or specific tradition?
Okay, so the meaning matters most. What else is heavily weighted?
Next comes condition and urgency of threat. This typically gets around 15%. It assesses how badly damaged the asset is right now and how quickly it's likely to deteriorate further if nothing is done. Is it actively unstable? Is it one bad winter away from partial collapse? This ensures that a really crucial structure that's about to fall down ranks higher than a less significant one that's damaged but relatively stable for now.
Makes sense. Prioritize the emergencies.
Then there's social use and public service value, also around 15%. How is the asset actually used by the community? Is it a place of worship? A school? Does it provide public access to important collections? Is it a vital community meeting space? This ensures that assets providing broad, tangible community benefit get prioritized. And, very importantly, life cycle sustainability. This looks at whether there's a credible, funded plan for the building's operations and maintenance after the repair work is finished. This usually carries about 10% of the score.
Okay, so that systematic weighting really forces the issue. It means a project that might be technically simple and cheap to fix, but has low cultural significance and no real community use, won't automatically jump to the front of the queue. It won't get prioritized over a more difficult, maybe more expensive project that is hugely significant to national identity and is under immediate threat of collapse.
Precisely. It systematizes the defense against that constant political pressure you often see in recoveries. The pressure to just build the easy, visible things quickly to show progress, even if they deliver very little long-term cultural or social value. And to add another layer of rigor, there are accountability thresholds. Proposals have to clear certain minimum scores on key criteria before they even get ranked by overall score or value for money.
What kind of thresholds?
For example, a project might need to achieve a minimum overall quality score, say 60 out of 100, just to be considered fundable at all. But crucially, It might also have to score at least, say, 3 out of 5 specifically on the significance criterion and at least 3 out of 5 on the O&M sustainability criterion.
So even if it scores okay overall, if it's deemed not very significant or if there's no credible plan to look after it afterwards, it gets filtered out.
Exactly. It gets filtered out before the final ranking based on cost effectiveness. This structured gate prevents cheap, relatively trivial projects that have no long-term future from front-running projects that are much more culturally vital but perhaps more technically challenging or expensive. It ensures a baseline of quality and viability.
That focus on life cycle sustainability, on what happens after the builders leave, seems absolutely critical. It's codified in that rule you mentioned earlier, the no orphan asset rule. This sounds like it's designed specifically to tackle that chronic problem of deferred maintenance that plagues so many restored buildings.
It is designed exactly for that. The no orphan asset rule is a hard financial gate. It dictates that the final finance approvals for a capital repair project stay red, meaning the main construction funds aren't released until a minimum period, usually 3 to 5 years, of routine, predictable maintenance funding is fully secured, either in an escrow account or some form of endowment.
3 to 5 years of maintenance funding up front. Why that long?
The rationale is painfully direct, based on experience worldwide. A beautifully restored asset often starts to decay again almost immediately after the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Why? Because the local custodians, whether it's a municipality or a small community group, simply lack the regular, unglamorous operational budget needed for routine care. We're talking about the basics: cleaning out gutters twice a year to prevent water damage, repairing small roof leaks before they become big ones, changing filters on climate control systems, dealing with minor test control, maybe cyclical painting of window frames. These are the small, predictable things that prevent catastrophic failure down the line.
So the escrow funding has to cover those specific, predictable, routine costs, not major unexpected repairs.
Precisely. The escrow is for the predictable stuff: scheduled annual roof inspections, planned maintenance of HVAC systems, cyclical repainting schedules, basic groundskeeping. By mandating this modest but essential long-term funding upfront, before the main capital investment is made, the program protects the newly restored asset from falling immediately back into disrepair. It insists on building in long-term stewardship right from day one. It fundamentally refuses to create a legacy of beautifully restored orphan assets that will just decay all over again within a decade because nobody budgeted for changing the light bulbs or fixing the drains. Tag 6. Rebuilding people, practice, and financial instruments.
You know, this whole systematic approach really drives home that the restoration isn't just about fixing the stones in the buildings. It's fundamentally about rebuilding the capacity to care for them. Which brings us back to the program's people-first agenda, renewing the skills, the practices.
Absolutely. That people-first agenda means the program explicitly invests in renewing practices, skills, and the institutions that support them. And the scope here deliberately extends far beyond just the tangible assets, the buildings and objects. It includes intangible heritage, too. That means the specialized skills needed to actually create and maintain the assets in the first place, the traditional crafts, the specific building techniques that might be dying out. And it also includes the living traditions that use these cultural places and objects, things like traditional music, local festivals, religious rituals, craft practices. The recognition is clear. When the physical places finally reopen after repair, they need to be animated by the living culture, the skills, the traditions that actually make them meaningful to the community. Otherwise, they're just empty shells.
So the goal is to fix the broken pipeline. The way skills are passed down from, say, apprentice to master craftsperson, make that pipeline local and resilient again.
Exactly. And the system actively links the physical restoration work directly to workforce development. It uses the power of procurement contracts as a lever to make this happen. Every single major capital project, every restoration site becomes a mandatory paid training site. The procurement contracts aren't just evaluated on lowest cost and technical quality. They're designed to require bidders, whether they're local companies or big international firms, to allocate a specific minimum percentage of their total working hours on that project to employing and training local apprentices.
And they have to identify trainers.
Yes. The bidders also have to name a certified master craftsperson who will be formally responsible for providing structured on-the-job instruction to those apprentices.
And this is actually enforced. It's not just nice words in a contract.
It's a hard contractual requirement. Failure to deliver those specified, verifiable training hours can directly affect the contractor's final payment, or it can even trigger contractual penalties. This structured approach forces that vital knowledge transfer and practical skill building right into the core economic activity of the recovery itself. And the training curricula aren't generic building skills either. They include specialized, often short, micromodules focused specifically on those traditional techniques that are at high risk of being lost forever, like how to properly mix and apply specific regional types of lime mortar, or traditional timber scarfing joints, or how to prepare and apply traditional decorative plasters. The learning is targeted, practical, and verifiable on-site.
That sounds like a really rigorous way to rebuild that essential supply chain of skilled labor from the ground up. But what about the risk of brain drain? You train these people up and then maybe they leave the country for better pay elsewhere. That's a huge risk in post-conflict situations, isn't it?
Oh, it's a massive challenge, absolutely. So running in parallel with the on-site training, the program also invests strategically in dedicated craft and conservation schools. These are often embedded within existing polytechnic institutes or vocational colleges, maybe focusing on specific material streams like stone conservation, traditional timber framing, or painting restoration. To directly combat brain drain, several strategies are used together. One is direct wage support for experienced master instructors to make teaching salaries competitive with private work or emigration. Another is offering retention bonuses for highly specialized staff who agree to work in more remote or potentially higher-risk regions where their skills are desperately needed.
And you mentioned residencies.
Yes. And critically, they run two-way residency programs. This means funding experienced masters from the Ukrainian diaspora, or even non-Ukrainian international experts, to come and teach intensive workshops locally for fixed periods. But it also means identifying the most talented local Ukrainian artisans and funding them to spend time rotating through partner conservation institutions abroad for advanced, specialized training. The key is they go on the condition that they return to guaranteed, better-paid posts within the National Recovery Program afterwards. It's about building capacity both ways.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged approach to skills. Now, funding all of this, the big capital repairs, the local skills training, supporting smaller community initiatives that requires more than just big government grants or international aid, presumably, it needs a more sophisticated, layered financial stack tuned to different needs.
The diverse financial toolkit is absolutely essential, yes, because different scales and types of problems need different financial instruments. You can't use a sledgehammer to crack every nut. So, for example, at the city planning level, where conservation efforts often restrict private development, like putting height caps on new buildings in historic city centers, they can utilize transferable development rights or TDRs.
TDRs, those sound quite complex. How do they actually work? How do they compensate a private owner who's told they can't build higher because of conservation rules while keeping the whole thing financially sustainable for the city?
Okay, TDRs basically work by decoupling the legal right to build from the physical land itself. Let's say a conservation ordinance stops a property owner in the protected historic core from building higher than 2 stories, meaning they lose out on potential rental income or apartment sales from, say, 3 extra floors they could otherwise have built. The city calculates the financial value of those lost potential floors, those unused development rights. This value is then issued to the owner as a TDR certificate. The owner can't use those rights on their historic site, but they can sell that certificate on the open market.
Sell it to who?
To a developer who wants to build higher than the standard zoning, allows in a different pre-approved receiving zone elsewhere in the city, usually an area designated for growth, not historically sensitive. The developer buys the TDR certificate, which gives them legal permission to add that extra density to their project in the receiving zone. So the net result is, the owner in the historic center gets financial compensation for the restriction. The historic core's character and scale are protected, and the city channels development pressure and density towards more appropriate growth areas rather than letting it overwhelm the heritage zones.
Right, it redirects development pressure financially. Clever. What about smaller scale needs?
For smaller projects, things too small or too local for national grant programs, they use revolving microfunds. These are designed to quickly get money flowing into the grassroots cultural economy. The idea is simple. Initial funding starts the pot. It makes small loans or grants, and then as those early loans are repaid, maybe by a craft cooperative that used the money to buy tools, or a community group that repaired their local center's roof, the repaid money immediately goes back into the pot to fund the next round of small projects.
So the money recycles locally.
Exactly. It supports things like small archive rehousing projects, historic shopfront repairs along a main street, maybe helping a traditional craft business get started. They're designed for speed and simplicity. Minimal paperwork, fast decisions, often short repayment cycles. It avoids small, vital local efforts getting bogged down in months of national-level bureaucracy, and it helps revitalize local economies and community pride quickly.
And the third instrument you mentioned was green finance. How does that fit with heritage?
Green finance is leveraged very specifically for upgrades to historic buildings that demonstrably improve their environmental performance and climate resilience. These are essentially investments that should pay for themselves over time through savings. Examples would be installing that high-performance reversible secondary glazing we talked about, or using special capillary active insulation materials that help old walls manage moisture better, or maybe installing highly efficient modern heat pumps instead of old, inefficient boilers.
And the green part is the energy saving.
Yes, these upgrades improve energy efficiency, sometimes dramatically. The resulting measurable savings on energy bills, lower heating costs, lower electricity use, significantly reduce the long-term operations and maintenance, O&M, financial burden, on the building's custodian, whether it's a church congregation or a museum trust. So it creates this perfect alignment where good conservation practice, like better insulation protecting the historic fabric from damp, also achieves tangible financial benefits, lower running costs. This makes the restored asset much more financially sustainable and viable over the long term.
Okay, so skills, finance, this all seems to feed into the need for planning at a much larger scale, right? The city or regional level, you mentioned the historic urban landscape or HUL, diagnosis.
Exactly. The HUL diagnosis is the critical tool for establishing the strategic rulebook for rebuilding entire urban areas. They often call this principle plan before you pour. This diagnostic work typically needs to run early, maybe from month 3 to month 12, often concurrently with that initial phase 0 emergency response. The HUL approach reads the city not just as a collection of individual important buildings, but as a living complex system. It layers understanding of the cultural landscape, the monuments, yes, but also the ordinary vernacular streets, the traditional economic activities, the public spaces, the sightlines, the intangible heritage associated with places, layers all that with the full, up-to-date risk picture. That risk picture includes all the known hazards, the map UXO locations, the floodplains, areas of ground instability, the blast damage zones we discussed.
And how does that big diagnostic map translate into actual binding rules for urban planning? How does HUL help protect, say, the character of ordinary residential streets, the vernacular architecture, not just the famous landmark monuments?
The goal is total integration of heritage thinking into standard planning practice. The HUL framework translates its findings, the mapping of significant areas, character zones, risk overlays into binding spatial codes, height limits, material palettes, and specific design guidelines. These are then formally integrated into the municipality's zoning regulations, their building permit issuance processes, and even their capital investment plans. For vernacular architecture, this might mean establishing mandatory design guidelines for things like roof profiles, window proportions, acceptable materials, or plot coverage for any new infill housing built in a particular historic neighborhood to ensure new development respects and reinforces the existing character rather than disrupting it.
So it bakes heritage protection into the day-to-day planning system.
Precisely. The HUL diagnosis ensures that heritage conservation isn't an afterthought, but is protected proactively through zoning, permits, and budgets. It integrates conservation planning directly with plans for housing, transport, economic development, and disaster risk reduction. So when the major reconstruction funds eventually arrive, the city already has a plan, a rulebook to ensure that rebuilding strengthens the city's unique character and resilience, instead of allowing poorly managed piecemeal reconstruction to accidentally erode it forever. #tagoutro.
So when you step back and look at this entire systematic structure, this whole operating manual, what does it tell us? It really feels like it's engineered specifically to resist the very chaos it's operating within.
I think that's the absolute core takeaway. The entire framework, right from that initial security gate check and phase 0 triage, all the way through to the really difficult ethical choices like the anisolosis decision, it's all designed deliberately to be disciplined, to be auditable, and to be repeatable. It's systematically engineered to push back against those natural intense pressures you always find in these situations. The pressure for haste, the pressure from politicians wanting quick, visible results, the pressure of changing aesthetic fashions. Things that often derail post-conflict restoration efforts around the world. By insisting relentlessly on verifiable evidence through the SSOT, on non-negotiable quality standards, those core principles, and on properly funded long-term care, that no orphan asset rule, the whole system ensures that every single action taken honors authenticity and truth-telling above absolutely everything else.
Yeah, it's clear the program doesn't just aim for rebuilt structures, does it? It's aiming for something bigger.
Yeah.
A truly resilient cultural commons, one that is, as they say, well-studied, well-kept, and well-used. And that core financial rule, The no orphan asset rule really feels like the most practical, concrete demonstration of that whole principle. It insists on the long-term viability of the asset from day one. It recognizes that for recovery to actually succeed, every single piece of restored stone, every conserved archive, has to be accounted for not just now, but for its future. Its long-term care has to be guaranteed through funded, credible maintenance plans.
And that level of operational discipline, the sheer amount of evidence and planning required just to get a project started, it forces one final thought, perhaps, for you, the listener. Considering the level of documented rigor that this framework demands, just to clear those initial gates, security, evidence, feasibility, what does that tell us about the hidden, immense costs of not documenting our own cultural assets thoroughly enough during peacetime? The absence of something as simple as a basic 3D scan or an accurate measured survey or properly cataloged archives before disaster strikes, that absence means that when tragedy does hit, the ability to restore with integrity, with authenticity, is severely compromised. Sometimes it's made completely impossible. The foresight we show or fail to show during quiet times fundamentally determines our capacity for faithful, truthful recovery when conflict or disaster eventually arrives.
That's a really compelling and maybe sobering observation on the absolute necessity of foresight and just detailed, unglamorous record keeping. Thank you for taking us through this deep dive into such rigorous systems thinking and cultural recovery.